On December 16, 1944, at 0530 hours, 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes Forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. American forces, holding defensive positions in what was considered a quiet sector, were caught completely off guard. Within hours, 250,000 German soldiers, 1,400 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces surged westward in the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. American intelligence had detected no indication of the attack. German forces had assembled within 50 kilometers of American positions without being discovered. Radio intercepts had revealed nothing. Aerial reconnaissance had seen nothing. Belgian resistance networks had reported troop movements, but these reports were dismissed. The German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. The attack drove 80 kilometers into Allied lines, creating a bulge in the front that gave the battle its name. Over 19,000 American soldiers were killed, and 47,000 were wounded or captured in 6 weeks of fighting. The 101st Airborne Division was encircled at Bastogne and held for a week before relief arrived. German losses exceeded 100,000 men, losses Germany could not replace. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive of the war. It failed to reach its objective, the port of Antwerp, and exhausted Germany's remaining strategic reserves. But the question remained: how did Germany hide 250,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks, and thousands of vehicles within 50 kilometers of American positions without being detected? The answer lay in operational deception, strict discipline, weather conditions, and American overconfidence. This analysis examines how the concealment was achieved and why American intelligence failed to detect it. In December 1944, the Western Allies held a continuous front from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Allied forces had liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. American and British armies were positioned along Germany's western border, preparing for the final push into the Reich. The strategic situation appeared favorable. Germany was retreating on all fronts. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. The assumption among Allied commanders was that Germany was incapable of launching significant offensive operations. The Ardennes sector, a heavily forested region in eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, was held by 4 American divisions spread across 80 miles of front. This was twice the frontage normally assigned to divisions in active sectors. The Ardennes was considered a quiet area, suitable for new divisions to gain experience, or veteran divisions to rest after heavy combat. The terrain, dense forests, steep valleys, limited roads, was judged unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. Intelligence assessments concluded that Germany would not attack through the Ardennes. Allied intelligence focused on German activity opposite the active sectors, north of the Ardennes near Aachen and south near the Saar. Reports indicated German units withdrawing to defensive positions. Intercepted communications suggested Germany was preparing to defend the Rhine River line. There was no indication of offensive preparations. American commanders at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force and at Field Army level shared the assessment that Germany's capacity for offensive action had been broken. This confidence was not baseless. Germany had suffered continuous defeats since the Normandy invasion in June. German industry was under sustained Allied bombing. Fuel shortages limited mechanized operations. Manpower reserves were depleted. However, intelligence analysts projected their own limitations onto the enemy. They assumed that because the Allies would find an Ardennes offensive difficult, Germany would as well. This assumption was the foundation of Allied dispositions in December 1944. When it proved incorrect, the consequences were immediate and severe. Adolf Hitler conceived the Ardennes offensive in September 1944 as Germany's last opportunity to reverse the strategic situation in the West. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, called for a rapid thrust through the Ardennes to seize the Belgian port of Antwerp splitting American and British forces and encircling 4 Allied armies north of the breakthrough. Hitler believed that a successful offensive would force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all forces against the Soviet Union. The operational concept mirrored the 1940 Ardennes offensive that had led to the fall of France. German planners identified the same weaknesses: lightly defended terrain, poor road networks that would slow Allied reinforcements, and forested areas that concealed assembly and movement. The plan called for 3 armies to attack on a narrow front. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, would drive northwest toward Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army, commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, would advance west toward the Meuse River and capture key road junctions. The 7th Army would protect the southern flank against American counterattacks. The offensive required assembling 250,000 men, organized into 30 divisions, including 13 armored and mechanized divisions. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies were stockpiled in forward areas. Over 1,400 tanks and assault guns were concentrated, including Tiger II heavy tanks and new models of Panther and Panzer IV tanks. Artillery support included 2,000 guns and multiple rocket launchers. The assembly and movement of this force, without detection, would require unprecedented operational security. Hitler imposed absolute secrecy. The operation's code name, Watch on the Rhine, was deliberately defensive to deceive Allied intelligence. Officers were briefed only at the last moment. Planning documents were restricted to the highest command levels. Troop movements were conducted under strict radio silence. Deception operations suggested Germany was preparing defensive positions along the Rhine. The success of the offensive depended entirely on achieving surprise. If Allied forces detected the build-up and reinforced the Ardennes, the attack would fail before it began. German forces achieved tactical surprise through systematic concealment measures enforced over 6 weeks. The methods combined operational security, movement discipline, deception, and exploitation of weather conditions. Each measure was necessary. Together, they prevented American intelligence from detecting the buildup. All troop movements occurred at night. Units assembled in the Eifel region, a forested area east of the Ardennes, and moved forward only after dark. Vehicles traveled with lights off or heavily shielded. Movement stopped before dawn, and units concealed themselves in forests during daylight. German military police enforced strict march discipline. Units that violated blackout procedures or moved during daylight were severely punished. Over 3 weeks, entire divisions moved from assembly areas in Germany to forward positions within 50 kilometers of American lines without being observed by Allied reconnaissance. Radio silence was absolute. All operational communications were transmitted by telephone or courier. Radio sets were removed from forward units or powered down. Fake radio traffic was transmitted from rear areas to simulate normal defensive activity. American radio intercept stations, which had been tracking German unit movements since Normandy, detected no change in activity. The radio silence extended to individual soldiers. Troops were ordered not to write letters or make personal transmissions that could reveal their locations. Acoustic deception concealed the movement of heavy equipment. German engineers used the sound of Allied aircraft to mask tank movements. When American or British aircraft flew overhead, German tank columns moved forward, their engine noise drowned out by aircraft engines. Artillery pieces were transported on horse-drawn wagons rather than motorized vehicles to reduce noise. Tanks were fitted with mufflers and moved on roads covered with straw to dampen sound. Luftwaffe aircraft flew over German positions at scheduled times to provide additional noise cover during critical movement periods. Weather was exploited. German meteorologists predicted a period of low clouds and fog in mid-December that would ground Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The offensive was scheduled to begin during this weather window. For the week preceding the attack, heavy cloud cover prevented American aerial reconnaissance from observing German positions. Allied intelligence relied heavily on air reconnaissance. Its absence created a critical intelligence gap. German deception operations reinforced the concealment of the Ardennes offensive. The deception plan, supervised by Hitler personally, aimed to convince Allied intelligence that Germany was preparing defensive operations along the Rhine and offensive operations elsewhere. Multiple deception measures were implemented simultaneously to create a coherent false picture. The operation's codename, Wacht am Rhein, was selected to suggest a defensive posture. Planning documents and communications referred to defensive preparations. Units participating in the offensive were issued defensive construction equipment and propaganda materials, emphasizing the defense of German territory. This deception extended to lower command levels. Divisional commanders were briefed that they were preparing to defend the Rhine until hours before the offensive began. The cover story was credible because Germany's strategic situation made defensive operations logical. Deception operations in northern Germany simulated preparations for an offensive toward Aachen or into the Netherlands. Dummy radio traffic suggested the concentration of armored units north of the Ardennes. Reconnaissance patrols were increased in these sectors to draw Allied attention. German agents fed false intelligence to Allied networks, reporting German defensive preparations in the Ardennes and defensive preparations elsewhere. These reports reinforced Allied assumptions. Security protocols were draconian. Officers involved in planning were confined to headquarters and prohibited from communicating with external contacts. Planning documents were hand-delivered by courier and could not be copied or transmitted electronically. Staff officers who discussed the operation outside secure locations were arrested. On December 10th, divisional commanders were briefed for the first time. Battalion commanders were briefed on December 14th, 2 days before the attack. Company commanders were briefed on December 15th. Soldiers learned of the offensive only when artillery opened fire on December 16th. The cumulative effect of these measures was that Allied intelligence received no reliable indication of German intentions. Reports from Belgian resistance about troop movements in the Eifel were dismissed as routine defensive activity. Captured German soldiers, interrogated in early December, revealed nothing because they knew nothing. Allied intelligence analysts, confident that Germany lacked offensive capability, interpreted all available information through this assumption. The deception succeeded because it aligned with what Allied commanders already believed. American intelligence possessed information indicating unusual German activity, but failed to interpret it correctly. The failure reflected overconfidence, analytical bias, and inadequate integration of intelligence sources. Belgian resistance networks transmitted reports of German troop movements in the Eifel region in late November. Reports described trains carrying tanks and artillery moving west toward the Ardennes. Local civilians reported increased German military activity in towns near the front. American intelligence officers received these reports, but assessed them as defensive preparations or routine troop rotations. Reports were not forwarded to higher headquarters with urgency. Signals intelligence detected anomalies. Radio intercept stations noted unusual radio silence among German units that had previously transmitted regularly. Traffic analysis suggested units were moving, but destinations could not be determined. American intelligence interpreted the silence as evidence that units were withdrawing to rest or refit. The possibility that radio silence indicated operational security for an offensive was not seriously considered. Tactical reconnaissance reported increased German artillery registrations, test firings to calibrate guns for targets. American forward observers noted more aggressive German patrolling along the Ardennes front in early December. These activities were consistent with offensive preparations, but analysts interpreted them as local actions to improve defensive positions. No connection was made between increased activity and a larger operational plan. On December 10th, a German deserter informed American interrogators that an offensive was imminent, providing details about unit concentrations and timelines. The report was dismissed. The source was considered unreliable, and the claim contradicted prevailing assessments. Similar reports from other sources were likewise discounted. Intelligence analysts were victims of confirmation bias. They sought information that validated existing assumptions and dismissed contradictory evidence. At Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, intelligence assessments in early December concluded that Germany was incapable of major offensive action. Weekly summaries emphasized German weaknesses and defensive preparations. The theater intelligence officer later acknowledged that staffs had projected Allied limitations onto the enemy, assuming Germany faced constraints that would prevent a winter offensive. At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, German artillery commenced firing along the Ardennes front. Over 2,000 guns and rocket launchers targeted American positions, command posts, communication centers, and artillery batteries. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. American units, many inexperienced or resting after combat, were caught in their positions. Communications were severed. Command posts were destroyed. Forward observers were killed or isolated. At 0700, German infantry and armor advanced. The 6th SS Panzer Army attacked in the north, targeting routes toward Liège. The 5th Panzer Army advanced in the center toward Bastogne and the Meuse River crossings. The 7th Army moved south to establish a defensive flank. German forces achieved immediate breakthroughs. American forward positions, held by isolated companies and battalions, were overrun. Entire units were surrounded and forced to surrender. American commanders at divisional and corps level struggled to understand the attack's scale. Initial reports suggested localized counterattacks. Communications breakdowns prevented accurate assessments. By midday, it became clear that a major offensive was underway, but the extent of German penetration was unknown. First Army headquarters ordered reserves forward, but the nearest available divisions were over 100 kilometers away. German forces advanced faster than American reinforcements could move. By evening, December 16th, German forces had penetrated 10 to 15 kilometers into American lines. Key road junctions were threatened. American units retreated westward, attempting to establish defensive lines, but German armored spearheads bypassed strongpoints and drove into rear areas. Fuel dumps and supply depots were evacuated as German tanks approached. On December 17th, German forces captured critical road networks and continued west. Saint-Vite, a major road junction, was surrounded. American engineers began demolishing Meuse River bridges to prevent German crossings. Supreme Headquarters committed the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to block German advances. By December 18th, German forces had advanced 40 kilometers, creating a bulge in the Allied front. The offensive had achieved operational surprise and tactical success. The question was whether German forces could sustain momentum. The German offensive reached its deepest penetration by December 22nd, when lead elements came within 6 kilometers of the Meuse River at Dinant. However, by this date, the offensive had lost momentum and was beginning to stall. Two factors were decisive: fuel shortages and the defense of Bastogne. German planning assumed advancing units would capture American fuel depots to sustain operations. German fuel reserves were insufficient for a prolonged offensive. Panzer divisions carried fuel for 150 to 200 kilometers of movement, enough to reach the Meuse, but not Antwerp. German forces overran several American supply depots in the first days, but in most cases, American engineers destroyed fuel stocks before retreating. German units that failed to capture fuel were immobilized. By December 20th, entire panzer battalions were stationary, unable to advance or retreat due to lack of fuel. German logistics could not resupply forward units because roads were clogged with traffic and under Allied air attack. Bastogne, a critical road junction in southern Belgium, became the battle's focal point. German forces encircled the town on December 20th, trapping the 101st Airborne Division and elements of armored and artillery units, approximately 18,000 men. German commanders demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts." The encircled forces held Bastogne, denying Germans access to key roads needed to supply advancing units. German attempts to reduce the pocket failed. American forces fought from defensive positions, supported by artillery and resupplied by air when weather permitted. Weather conditions improved on December 23rd. Clear skies allowed Allied air forces to resume operations. American and British aircraft attacked German supply columns, fuel depots, and troop concentrations. Luftwaffe aircraft attempted to contest Allied air superiority, but were outnumbered and outmatched. Air attacks disrupted German logistics and inflicted casualties on exposed columns. American reinforcements arrived. General George Patton's Third Army, positioned south of the Bulge, disengaged from offensive operations, wheeled north, and attacked the southern flank. Patton's forces advanced 100 kilometers in 48 hours under winter conditions. On December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through and relieved Bastogne. The siege was lifted. By early January 1945, German forces had withdrawn to their starting positions. The offensive had failed to achieve any strategic objective. Antwerp was not reached. Allied forces were not split. No separate peace was negotiated. The battle cost Germany over 100,000 casualties, 600 tanks and assault guns, and critical fuel and ammunition reserves that could not be replaced. Germany's capacity to defend against the coming Allied and Soviet offensives was irreparably weakened. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including 19,000 killed, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement for American forces in Europe. Entire divisions were mauled. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theater, lost over 7,000 men in the first days of the fighting. However, American losses were replaced. Reinforcements arrived from the United States. Equipment was resupplied. By late January, American forces had returned to offensive operations. The battle demonstrated the limits of tactical surprise. German forces achieved complete surprise and significant initial success, but operational and strategic factors, fuel shortages, logistics, Allied air power, and rapid reinforcement prevented the surprise from being decisive. The offensive succeeded tactically but failed operationally. Once Allied forces absorbed the initial shock and committed reserves, German forces lacked the resources to sustain the advance. The concealment of 250,000 soldiers within 50 kilometers of American positions was a remarkable achievement in operational security and deception. It succeeded because of strict discipline, systematic execution of concealment measures, favorable weather, and exploitation of Allied overconfidence. American intelligence failure was institutional. Analysts dismissed evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Intelligence sources were not integrated effectively. The assumption that Germany was incapable of offensive action prevented recognition of what was occurring. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's final offensive. After January 1945, German forces in the West fought only defensive actions. The resources expended in the Ardennes could have been used to defend the Rhine or delay Soviet advances in the East. Hitler's decision to gamble on a winter offensive depleted Germany's last reserves and hastened the war's end. The battle remains a case study in operational deception, intelligence failure, and the consequences of strategic miscalculation.